There's nothing good about Good Friday. This is a theological contortion someone made to make Jesus' death more palatable. Those who bore witness to Jesus' execution that day would be confused and perhaps horrified to learn that we remember that dehumanizing spectacle, the day of torture and despair, that day of unmitigated defeat, and we call it good. Some Christian traditions call this day Holy Friday, others Great Friday, which makes it even worse. Some refer to today as Black Friday, long before the Walmart commandeered the term. What word would you use to describe today? How would you encapsulate the events that we commemorate? How would you sum up with a word the story that we came to hear? I don't know if there is a good name for today. I think even the greatest poets fell silent when contemplating the full gravity of what we are remembering today. That could be why there's the temptation to relieve the tension of today. There's the impulse to diffuse the power of the day, softening its violent decisiveness. There's the urge to turn this day into a peaceful reflection on the mysteries of life and death, of sin and forgiveness. It's a day to lay flowers at the cross rather than meet its stark reality. We restrain the human sin that drove the nails into his body by spouting cliches that say he didn't need nails in his hands and feet because his love would have hung him there. We downplay human complicity in the death of God's own child by saying that Jesus came to earth to die rather than him being the victim of injustice. We ignore human brokenness that Jesus came to identify with by jumping ahead of a few days in the story while the body is still warm. So we call today Good Friday. It minimizes the impact, it softens the blow. The words we use to describe Jesus' death, again, tend to muffle the effect. Artistic renderings often portray a suffering Jesus, but not a suffering we would recognize. With the exception of the tortured Christ by the Brazilian artist Guido Rocha, most depictions of Jesus' death sanitize his suffering to protect us from worshiping a God who suffers. So do you think God suffers? Do you think God has any sense of what we human beings live with? Do you think God has any understanding of what it means to live the limits of mortality or the emptiness of grief? Does God's heart break in ways that would help God appreciate our human hearts? The question of whether or not God suffers is actually a source of theological controversy. Many Christians believe that if God is perfect and suffering is a mark of imperfection, then God, therefore, cannot suffer. That may sound theologically correct, but I'm not sure it's true. I'm not convinced of their definition of perfection, and I'm not sure that non-suffering perfection is actually the goal. And when I hear people say that God can't or doesn't suffer, I'm tempted to ask if they've ever spent time in an intensive care unit, or if they've walked through a children's palliative care ward, or sat with a family who'd just been told a loved one was killed in a freak accident, or taken down by murder, or was a victim of suicide. I wonder if they ever had to help someone find meaning in a death that seemed just absolutely senseless, and the loss devastatingly useless. Senselessness and useless suffering and loss, and that's a reality that we just can't live with. And we wonder, can God live with it, not live with it as well? A child killed by a drunk driver, a young dad taken by cancer, an elderly woman dying alone in her apartment, and no one remembers her. Senseless, useless death. And that's a hard job for anyone, especially if you believe in a non-suffering God. A non-suffering God cannot live with that, cannot experience that. But that's the human task, and that's the divine task. Finding meaning in meaningless suffering. Making sense of senseless loss. Ensuring that what's being taken from us has not been in vain. Even safeguarding our own deaths against the empty and pointless nothingness that we worry will meet us when we close our eyes for the last time. We don't just want our lives to mean something. We want our deaths to mean something too. Because is there any meaning in a child dying from leukemia? What meaning is there in the wife wired to machines, drawing her final breath, after catching an infection during what should have been a routine operation? What meaning is there in a soldier coming home after fighting in a war we asked him to fight, only to have the demons of that conflict overtake him and he takes his own life, leaving a young family? Where is the perfect, non-suffering God then? Where is there meaning in these deaths? Are they senseless and useless? How do we come to terms with that loss? And these deaths happen all the time, every day. What do we make of them? About 15 years ago, while I was living in Lethbridge, I buried a 23-year-old man, young guy. He was hit by a car while walking home from the pub with his brother. They were doing all the right things. They had a few beers, so they left the car at the pub. They decided to walk home rather than drive. As they were arriving at the highway off-ramp, they looked both ways and started crossing. But as they got a few steps in, a pickup truck came around the corner. It was too late for the truck to stop, and there's no time for the young man to jump out of the way. The young man was hit straight on, and he never regained consciousness. And his brother watched the whole thing. It was one of those phone calls you get late at night when you know something awful has happened. I arrived at the hospital and prayed with the family and with the young man. The young man was airlifted to Calgary, where a medical staff tried in vain to save his life. His organs were harvested, which helped save the lives of others, but that didn't bring a whole lot of comfort to the family. So how did this happen? Why did this happen? The brothers were doing everything right, everything they were told to do. Instead of driving with alcohol, in their blood, they decided to walk home. They looked both ways before they crossed the street. Isn't that what we're supposed to do? And the driver of the truck was neither drunk nor speeding. He just didn't have the time to stop when he saw the young man crossing the intersection. Senseless, useless, suffering and loss. And the young man's dad decided to ensure that his son's death meant something. Launched a campaign for the city to build a pedestrian bridge over that crosswalk. It would cost $1.2 million, and the city could dip into the reserve funds to pay for it. And the city, while sympathetic for a father's loss, said that a bridge wasn't needed. They suggested just clearing some dirt to make the crosswalk visible from the highway, slowing the speed of the exit, and putting lights over the crosswalk. This would solve the problem at a much lower cost. The dad was incensed. To him, this was an insult. How dare the city nickel and dime his son's memory? A bridge had to be built, and it had to be named after his son. The solution could not be done on the cheap. His son's death had to mean something. It couldn't be just a senseless, useless death. The city ultimately rejected the dad's demands, but they followed through on their recommendations, and this crosswalk is much safer than it was. And the dad, to this day, is bitter that no bridge was built to protect pedestrians, which would have been the memorial he wanted for his son. So for him, his son's death was and is senseless and useless. When I would visit with the family, this dad did not want to hear about a perfect, non-suffering God who had a perfect plan for his son and his son's death. This dad did not want to hear about a perfect, non-suffering God who was quietly engineering the universe in ways that are mysterious to our mere mortals. This dad did not want to hear about a perfect, non-suffering God who received his son into heaven by grace through faith, because that's not where this dad wanted his son to be. This dad did not want to hear about a perfect, non-suffering God, because this perfect, non-suffering God did not help his son any. This perfect, non-suffering God with a perfect plan for his life was AWOL at that moment when his son needed protection. This perfect, non-suffering God with a perfect plan for his life was nowhere to be found when his son stepped off that curb. And this perfect, non-suffering God with a perfect plan for his life was absent when the truck exited the ramp. Where was the perfect, non-suffering God then? Where was the perfect plan? I think that perfect, non-suffering God wants nothing to do with us. Or the perfect, non-suffering God sees the human predicament as this abstract puzzle, one to be solved, rather than entered into. This perfect, non-suffering God looks at us in judgment. This perfect, non-suffering God has no idea what life is like for us mere mortals. And for those who confess the perfect, non-suffering God, make excuses for human suffering and God's lack of activity to stop it. Suffering must be because of something that we have done. We cause our own suffering. God is a great healer, so God can stop the suffering. When we stop suffering, then we are most like God. We reflect the image of the perfect, non-suffering God when we don't suffer. And I hear this all the time, blaming people when they are at their worst moments, protecting God's inaction, which usually means protecting their own understanding of God and protecting their fears of their own suffering. And this usually takes the form of platitudes. God doesn't give you any more than you can handle. Well, I can name you several cases off the top of my head where people definitely could not handle what they were given. Well, God took your daughter because he wanted another angel in heaven. Well, God can create angels however God wants. Did God really have to rip my daughter from me to get another angel? And this one I really hate. God is all good all the time. I hear this a lot, and I have no idea what it means, other than protecting God against angry and legitimate questions. And these legitimate questions, sadly, are nothing new. They've been asked since the beginning of time. In fact, the book of Job is about suffering, and that is the oldest book of the Bible, which tells me people have been asking this question from the very beginning. And those who stood by Jesus on the hill that day were witnessing a familiar yet horrific scene. They had questions, hard questions, real questions, questions without any answers, questions they couldn't put into words, questions that they could only feel. They felt the helplessness and the hopelessness of watching Jesus being tortured. They felt the outrage of the injustice. They felt the terror of the death. And God did too. It was at that moment when Jesus took his final breath that heaven and earth finally met. They touched. It was at that moment when Jesus' heart stopped beating that God looked down at this world and felt all the sorrow, all the anger, all the fear, all the loss, all the failure. All of this was felt in God's own beating heart, and God felt the finality of death. Of all the prayers that Jesus prayed on our behalf, it was that moment which he hung lifeless on that cross that was his ultimate intercession. His lifeless body was a silent prayer, praying to God for us, showing God the depths of human brokenness and limitations. His lifeless body was a proclamation, not just to us, but to God as well. His lifeless body was crying out to God, saying, See what this world has become? See what your children are facing? See what your beloved creatures are living with and losing day after day after day? And not just see it, feel it. Feel it in that bones. Let that pain eat away from you from the inside out. Now you know what it's like to lose something. Now you know what it's like to be afraid. Now you know what it feels like to have your heart ripped out of you. Now you know what it feels like to be a victim. Now you know what it's like to lose a son. The heavens fell silent. The angels stopped singing. No songs of praise were heard that day. No hymns were being sung around the throne. A terrible stillness settled in the heavens realm. God waits and listens to the silence. A silence so deep and so raw. A silence speaking truth. A truth that moves beyond words and past fears. God has entered human sorrow. God has been made perfect in suffering. God's eyes have been opened to creation's groaning, not from outside, distant from its cries, but from the very heart of it. And from the grief that can only come from a parent losing a child, Jesus' words reach God's ears. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. God stops and lets that prayer nestle in the ears of the Almighty. This is no perfect, non-suffering God. This is a God who has been made perfect in suffering. This is a God whose heart has been ripped open. This is a God who became a victim. This is a God who felt the deepest of loss. And God listens again to Jesus' prayer that has not left his ears. Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And wiping away a tear, God looks down at our suffering world and feels it in God's own body, the sorrow of every human heart that led to this moment, and says, so that everything and everyone in heaven and on earth can hear, I forgive.